So my sermon this morning is called Why the Buddha Sat Under the Bodhi Tree. And I want to begin with a reading by Wendell Berry. It's a poem of his called I Go Among Trees and Sit Still. I go among trees and sit still. All my stirring becomes quiet. Quiet around me like circles on water. My tasks lie in their places where I left them, asleep like cattle. And then what I am afraid of comes. I live for a while in its sight, and what I fear in it leaves it, and the fear of it leaves me. It sings, and I hear its song. So back in April on Earth Day, about 15 or 20 of us from church gathered at Polly Hill Arboretum. Our intention was to deepen our connection with the earth by walking slowly and meditatively over a small but beautiful portion of the earth's surface. We walked with our senses open and awake so that we could see, touch, smell, and hear the natural world, connect with our gratitude for and delight in the earth. And as our walk got underway that morning, I found my senses and my spirit leading me over to a cluster of Asian cypress trees, great big evergreens with thick branches of long green needles. Beneath one of the cypresses, I sat down on a soft blanket of fallen pine needles, which had been warmed by the spring sun. I straightened my back against the trunk of the tree, feeling its rough bark against my spine, and I just sat there for a while. I find that I'm never alone while sitting beneath a large tree. Looking up into its dark canopy, I saw chickadees and jays. On the ground beside me, bugs and insects scuttled through the fallen needles. Nearby, fat bees buzzed, and a squirrel shot me a wary glance. Every tree is its own little ecosystem, its own cosmos. Sitting beneath the tree, sheltered by its branches, cradled in its roots, it's easy to feel that I too am part of its ecology, part of its world. And as I sat under that cypress at Polly Hill, I got to thinking about how one of the great stories of spiritual transformation takes place beneath a tree, right? I'm speaking of the enlightenment of the Buddha beneath the Bodhi tree. You might remember that I began telling the Buddha's story a couple of weeks ago. The story of how the young Gautama had lived a privileged life, sheltered from the deprivations of the world, until one day, while riding in his father's chariot, he saw a dead man by the side of the road and was overcome by the reality of the world's suffering. You remember I shared with you this figurine called the Weeping Buddha that represents young Gautama's sensitivity to the suffering and pain of the world. Well, the very next day, Gautama set out on a quest to better understand the source of our suffering, as well as the spiritual means by which we might ease and relieve our suffering. So he fled the privilege of his father's palace, and for many years he wandered the country begging for his meals and living a life of poverty and asceticism. Yet for all the mortifications of the flesh he subjected himself to, he came no closer to the truth that he sought. Not until he found the Bodhi tree. Now, some say it happened during the full moon of May, right about this time of year. While wandering through a wooded grove, Gautama discovered a beautiful Bodhi tree, a ficus. In India, the Bodhi tree had long been a special, even a sacred tree. Generations of weary travelers had taken shelter under its large and curving branches. Its heart-shaped leaves were said to have healing properties. Its complex root system afforded places for small creatures to burrow and hide. The tradition says that when Gautama saw the tree, he was struck by an intuition, a memory really of a time when as a child he had sat beneath an apple tree on his father's estate and found there a deep sense of peace. And with this memory in mind, Gautama approached the Bodhi tree and he circled it one time and then sat cross-legged beneath the tree, facing east, vowing not to get up until he found the answers he sought. It turns out I have another carved figure I wanted to show you this morning. This is a beautiful carving from India of the Buddha sitting under the Bodhi tree. Notice how the tree shelters and surrounds him. Notice, if you can, his peaceful countenance. Well, here the Buddha sat and sat and sat. No one's certain just how long he meditated under the Bodhi tree. Some traditions say 7 days, some say 7 weeks. In any case, one morning the Buddha stood up from underneath the tree and he roared like a lion. And the Bodhi tree rained down flowers upon him, for he had finally attained the enlightenment he sought. He'd finally found insight into the problem of human suffering. And part of what he discovered under the Bodhi tree, I think is important for us to remember, friends, because part of what he discovered there is that so much of our suffering comes from our attachment to an idea of ourselves as discrete and isolated beings. But that's not the whole story of who we are. The antidote to our suffering, learned the Buddha, is to relinquish the myth of the isolated self and embrace a sense of self that is one with all of creation. To allow the false barriers between self and world and self and earth, self and other, to let them fall like scales from our eyes. Thich Nhat Hanh would say that under the Bodhi tree, the Buddha discovered the truth of our interbeing. Thich Nhat Hanh always used to like to say, we don't be, we interbe. Our fundamental interconnection with all life. Now, I've got no proof, and it's really just a hunch. But I have to believe that it wasn't just a coincidence that the Buddha was sitting under a tree when he came to this revolutionary insight. I mean, he could have chosen another location to sit down and meditate, right? I mean, he could have gone up to a mountaintop or, found a nice spot to look out across the sea, but he didn't. Led by his intuition and by that memory of sitting under the apple tree as a child, the Buddha chose the Bodhi tree as the place for his enlightenment. Or maybe it chose him. Because there, sheltered beneath the tree's generous canopy and enfolded in its large sinuous root system, with the sound of the great wind blowing through the leaves of the tree, I have to believe that the Buddha couldn't help but feel the boundaries of self slip away, couldn't help but feel his identity merging with that of the tree and the earth and all of creation. It was the tree that helped him experience all this. And I think the trees can help us experience something like this too. Wendell Berry writes, "I go among trees and sit still. All my stirring becomes quiet around me like circles on water. My tasks lie in their places, right where I left them, asleep like cattle. Then what I am afraid of comes. I live for a while in its sight. What I fear in it leaves it, and the fear of it leaves me. It sings, and I hear its song." For me, Barry's poem describes an enlightenment not unlike that of the Buddha. In the presence of great trees, in the presence of the natural world, the poet's cares don't evaporate so much as they are put in their proper perspective, right? And his fears don't disappear, but rather lose their sting. They lose their power over him. As the poet's sense of self expands to include the natural world, his suffering diminishes. I think that many of us who walked among the trees at Polly Hill on Earth Day got a taste of what the Buddha and the poet are getting at here. Maybe we've all gotten this taste. We all came that morning with our cares and our sorrows and our busy lives, our fears for the future of our planet. But after an hour or so communing with one another and with the earth, our cares seem to recede just enough to afford us a sense of grace and peace. And we return to our lives better prepared to meet the challenges that lay ahead. You know, friends, for years I've preached about the seventh principle of Unitarian Universalism, which is respect for the interconnected web of existence of which we are a part. But over all that time, I think I really only ever got it half right. I got that we should respect the earth, but I didn't really understand that second part that says that I am a part of the earth, part of the interconnected web. I just didn't feel that. And what I've come to realize is if we don't feel that sense of interconnectedness, then I'm not sure we can ever really get what it means to respect and care for the earth. But that's all changing for me now. As I muddle through middle age, I sense many changes happening inside of me. Changes in how I understand myself and my relationship to the world. One of those changes is that after years of preaching about the interconnectedness of life, I'm finally allowing myself to feel it. Sometimes I feel it when I'm sitting beneath a cypress tree, enveloped by its branches and roots. Sometimes I feel it when we sing together in church or pray together. Sometimes I feel it when I'm overcome with love for my husband and son. At long last, the rigid boundaries of self and ego are softening, and I'm slowly finding my home in the web of creation. I hope you are too. I want to close by saying that before we left Polly Hill that morning, Barb Cassot told our group the story of the Arboretum's founding. Some of you probably know it. Turns out that Polly Hill, the Arboretum's founder and namesake, planted her first seeds for the Arboretum back in 1957. She was 50 years old then, which is how old I am now. I was struck that she planted those seeds at an age when she knew she'd never live to see those trees reach their full maturity. What an act of faith in our future. What a gift to us and to future generations. It just goes to show that it's never too late for us to sow seeds that may one day bless the earth and generations to come. That cypress I sat beneath that day was planted as a seed 65 years ago by a far-sighted and generous woman. May we be blessed with similar vision. May we be blessed with a generous care for our planet, for one another, and for the generations to come. Amen. Friends, our closing hymn this morning is number 83 in our gray hymnal. It's called Winds Be Still. For those in the sanctuary, in the chapel, I invite you to rise as you are able, and may we all join in singing our closing hymn. Please be seated, friends, for our benediction, and then invite you to remain seated for our postlude today. As our benediction, I offer you this prayer from the Navajo people. With beauty before me, I walk. With beauty behind me, I walk. With beauty above me, I walk. With beauty around me, I walk. In beauty all day long, may I walk. Through many returning seasons, may I walk. On the trail marked with pollen, may I walk. With dew about my feet, may I walk. In old age, wandering on a trail of beauty, lively may I walk. In old age, wandering on a trail of beauty, living again, may I walk. All has become beauty again. Amen.